blinding speakers. So I finally had something worth sharing with you, so I'm happy to be here and talk about the results from the Minnesota Solar Pathways project. Brian Ross will be here too. He's my lead facilitator for this work that the Department of Commerce is engaged in with the Department of Energy and several partners. So we will get into that. And first, I just want to say happy solstice, everyone. It's nice that you came out on a beautiful summer evening, and so we're going to share it together. And we have a lot to celebrate in Minnesota this solstice. In terms of our solar activity, in the last year, we've just been on fire. 2017 was a record year for solar in Minnesota. We installed almost 500 megawatts of solar PV. And when you think about a rate like that, we're installing over a megawatt per day. And it was just 2009 when we hit 1 megawatt cumulative. And that was something worth celebrating at the time. Doug probably remembers, you might clap and applause. It was a regular party. And now we're doing that every day. So it's quite exciting. Lately, we've seen a lot of community solar. Probably about half of the capacity that's been going in is community solar. And as Doug refers to, my sidekick, Brian Ross, just walked in. We'll let him get settled, and then we'll just tag team the presentation. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I know it's with the help of a lot of people. It's not just people at the state legislature or the governor or my office, but lots of nonprofits and volunteers and solar enthusiasts and professionals, utilities, all working together to get this capacity in. And I am really pleased to be part of it. So, Brian, we're just introducing the Pathways project.
Have that, yes.
Did you have?
Yes, I'm curious about how the state collects the information about the installations. Do the utilities report up, or is it part of the application process to report to the state, or how does that happen?
That's a good question. The utilities report annually to the state. It's a requirement, and we compile that data once a year for sure, and then we get some interim reporting too. And sometimes it's just combing through the newspaper if we happen to see something, 10 megawatts here, 5 there. And we just compile it as we go. And I brought some solar fact sheets with me. They're out there on the sign-in table. Feel free to take one of those. It's also on our website. It's already out of date though. So I think it probably says something around 717 megawatts of solar at the end of 2017. And we're already at 844 megawatts.
Wow.
So quite a bit going on, even considering that the first part of the year, we're just getting out of the winter season here. So today we're going to start with a question, and that question is, what does solar look like all grown up? And it's a question that we didn't necessarily embark on intentionally, but we realized at some point, and maybe it was Brian that said it, I'm not sure, that we had actually stumbled on, through this Pathways project that we're going to talk about tonight, we've stumbled on what it means to have a mature solar market. And so we're anxious to share that with you. It's looking at the different strategies of getting to higher penetrations of solar. So the medium to high penetration is looking at 10% solar by 2030, because this project was built around that statutory goal. And then going beyond that and looking at 70% solar plus wind by 2050. So under market transformation conditions, what is solar capable of when it's combined with energy storage? or the ability to curtail, demand response, complementary wind. And if you put all that together, we're going to just give you a glimpse, I guess, of what that can look like. So we'll start with a project overview and then talk about the solar potential analysis. That's the bulk of what we'll be presenting on today. We'll introduce the solar deployment strategy. It's also a modeling tool. And then I think Brian is planning to do some surveying. So you can have your phone handy if you'd like to participate in that later at the end of the discussion. I'll ask you some questions about your priorities and thoughts about solar. So Minnesota Solar Pathways is a 3-year project. It's funded by the Department of Energy. These federal dollars are really important for states. We feel really fortunate to have been funded. It's a $2.8 million project, $2 million of which came from the Department of Energy. And the whole aim is based on the Sunshot Initiative that was formed in 2011, with the goal of getting down to 6 cents per kilowatt hour of solar at the utility scale. Department of Energy set a goal of 2020 to achieve that. They met it 3 years early. It was through the efforts in R&D as well as addressing soft costs of solar, other considerations for deployment of solar, finance, and you put all this together, we met the goal 3 years early, and they've since set a new goal for 2030 of 3 cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV. So, yes, questions. We're happy to take questions as we go. Brian and I talked about this.
Okay, is that generated cost or is that delivered cost? Generation plus distribution or just generation?
Oh, that's generation. That's a good question. Yes. So that's, think of it, I guess, as the installed cost.
Yeah.
So, ours is just one of many projects funded by the Department of Energy, Solar Energy Technologies Office. They've since rebranded Sunshot. It's just part of the Solar Energy Technologies Office goals. But they're doing remarkable things across the country. So here on the left, we have the core partners. There were 5 organizations leading this project. We worked with Great Plains Institute, where Brian's from, Clean Power Research, Clean Energy Research Teams, Center for Energy and Environment. Together with Commerce, we all worked on the proposal. We're leading a 3-year project, but with the help of a lot of other partner organizations. There are a lot of people that have committed time and even funds to make sure that people show up and offer input into this project to make it more meaningful. So this is a list, and you'll see it includes a lot of utilities, there's nonprofits, there's solar industry represented. We have someone from the National Renewable Energy Lab, corporations with sustainability goals. That was a new one that we identified as we recognize that this is bigger than just state policy and utility goals, but it's really about making sure that customers, big and small, can achieve goals for solar and sustainability. So during the 3 years, we have 4 deliverables listed here. The first involves interconnection. We did an interconnection streamlining assessment where our partner utilities voluntarily went through surveys with the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, and described in great detail what happens when you get an interconnection application. The utilities went through the whole process, and this took some days and lots of staff time. And there's a summary report, it's already on our website, that describes MRES recommendations for automating and streamlining interconnection for these utilities, particularly as they scale up. As we mentioned, we're almost at 1 gigawatt of solar installed, and there's more coming. So this will become increasingly important as we see higher and higher penetrations of solar. The next one is the solar potential analysis. That's our first modeling exercise. That's the one we'll be covering tonight with our initial results. We'll have a final report out later this summer. So for now, we're giving you a sneak peek with our draft results. And also the hosting capacity analysis, where we're looking not just at static hosting capacity, but also considering what can we do, how much solar can we fit on a particular feeder if we include strategies such as smart inverters or energy storage, the ability to curtail excess solar on these special days. And what we found was that in most cases, those strategies can actually accommodate more solar on a feeder without traditional means of building out additional infrastructure. And then finally, the solar deployment strategy, also a modeling tool that we'll be using, and Brian will be introducing that as well today. So the solar potential analysis, I mentioned it was the first of 2 modeling exercises that the team undertook. We've got our initial results, and the whole goal was to examine the least cost strategies to optimize solar in a way that gets to the lowest levelized cost per kilowatt hour. And this was informed by all those stakeholders that you saw. And we had NREL give us inputs for projecting the costs, because we anticipate costs of solar will continue to decline. But basically, our inputs included simulated solar. This is all done by Clean Power Research. They are software and they do programming, etc. Very capable. We got MISO data to model the wind that complements solar, and also utility loads from the utilities themselves and from MISO. We put that on top of those pricing forecasts for energy, storage, wind, and solar. And then this is where we got lots of input from the technical committee, where they defined scenarios for us. Now we know that as we go forward, we'll continue to see greater adoption of solar and wind. We expect that. But we also know that there will be some range within reason, that we might predict both a lower bound and an upper bound. We call that high and low technology development. So we had a range that the technical committee was comfortable with. Then we talked about production profiles. Are you going to go over that, Brian? A little bit? Yes, actually, there are some slides.
Okay, good.
We talked about, okay, so utility-led versus like a full market participation. Right now, that 850 megawatts that we have is primarily utility scale, with some community solar in there as well. And what happens if maybe at some point we start to see more rooftop deployment versus looking again at primarily utility scale. We were able to model both scenarios to look at the cost impacts. And we looked at the 2025 and 2050 timeframes for this model. Yeah, the output, again, is the levelized cost, optimized for solar, energy storage, and wind. So I'm starting with our draft conclusions. This is what we found. Oops. I like this set better. I didn't go back and change it, but these are our draft conclusions, and we feel pretty good about sharing these with you. Basically, this modeling tells us, and I think the entire technical community agrees, that achieving levels of 10% solar by 2030, as stated in our statute as a goal, is completely reasonable. That the cost of doing so is competitive with other options for generation. So that was our big takeaway. We also found that solar and wind are complementary. Both are needed in combination with energy storage to get to these medium and higher penetration levels that we're looking at. Solar and wind capacity in combination with storage has more value when it's dispatchable, as opposed to being simply a variable resource. Because what we found was that there are certain times of the year when you approach 10% solar, that you're actually starting to eat into baseload generation. Now, for the 2050 timeframe, we didn't really consider baseload. But for 2025, we did, because there will be some coal, nuclear that will still be operating.
I'm sorry, what was that? Can you just say more clearly what dispatchable versus variable means?
Yes. A dispatchable resource is one that's available on demand. It's on the ready, and you might think of gas peakers that can respond quickly. That's a very dispatchable resource. Energy storage is dispatchable. In order for solar and wind to be dispatchable, they need a complement of energy storage to go with it. And so now you can just call on that solar, and even though the sun went down 2 hours ago, you still have solar energy. But there are some brief periods in the year. This is really interesting, and I think Brian has a graph that'll show this very well. But brief periods of the year in which very low availability of solar and wind drives the need to overbuild solar, wind, and energy storage capacity just to meet that week during winter solstice when there's not a lot of wind or solar. And then finally, electric vehicles and domestic hot water, mood shifting. While they're promising, they have their limitations, and we'll talk about that later. But as part of this project, we wanted to look at that. We wanted to look at what happens when you electrify transportation. I saw some EVs, electric vehicles, out in the parking lot today. So as we get more and more electric vehicles, that'll change our modeling, and we assumed the adoption of that. We also looked at electrifying domestic hot water and space heating as part of this too. So this is our graphic for the number one take-home point, and that is that Minnesota can very reasonably achieve 10% solar by 2030 in keeping with the state statute goal, and do so at in a way that's very cost competitive. Brian, you want to take over? This is my colleague Brian Ross. He facilitates this group of stakeholders, and he works with Great Plains Institute. So we'll talk more about the solar potential analysis now.
Okay, so the solar potential analysis has this time frame, this long time frame, as Stacy kind of noted, from the 2025 kind of point, or 2030 when we're looking at 10% solar, and then a longer term, kind of a long run scenario, out 50, approaching 50 years. Well, I guess it would only be 30 years, but where we're looking at when all things are variable. Baseload generation has largely been retired. All the generation options are basically open. We have an opportunity to really revamp the entire generation system. Let's make it be what we want it to be. And so the solar potential analysis is a scenario-based analysis to look at those two time frames of the different ways that we can achieve these renewable energy goals, particularly focusing on the variability of solar and wind, and how do we mitigate for that variability in terms of getting a predictable and reliable generation regime and portfolio for Minnesota. Okay, so there's two time frames, as I said earlier. There's the 2025 time frame, and Stacy mentioned this. 10% of electric generation is from solar and about 25% from wind. That was the kind of fixed amounts that we modeled in that scenario. It included what we call must-run resources, which are, people call them baseload resources, things that you can't turn off and on, that are running pretty much all the time. They're already in rate base, they're already been paid for. It's very difficult to back them out of the system, so we kind of left a certain amount of those in the system in the modeling. And we did assume, as part of that scenario, that there would be a continuing trend in renewable energy cost declines, both for solar and for wind, as well as increasing amounts of load electrification, the kind of electrification of transportation that Stacy noted, as well as HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and water heating. The 2025 time frame, again, was the long run, where we said the target we were trying to get to was 70% of the total electric generation in the state being from solar or from wind. And we assumed that there would be no must-run resources, no base load. Effectively, all those things are going to be retired. And we also used the forecast, the best available information on forecasting for how renewable energy and storage costs are declining, and what the anticipated electrification of the economy was going to be in terms of, by 2050, we were looking at pretty much the bulk of the passenger fleet that I think was going to be electric powered of some kind, and a significant amount of the non-passenger fleet, for instance, and those are the kind of forecasts that we incorporated into the model. There was a number of different scenarios that we looked at, and Stacy already mentioned a couple of those. We had the production profile, the technology development scenario, and then the different deployment scenarios. The production profile that was important because what we wanted to do was overcome this question of variability in the solar and the wind energy resource, and say, how can we use a combination, a portfolio of resources, in this case, solar and wind and storage and load shifting, in order to achieve a production profile that we want to achieve, rather than just say, we'll get solar when the sun shines and we'll get wind when the wind blows. We say, what does it take to actually get a production profile that matches load? And we had a number of different of those production profiles we looked at, and the technical committee worked with that, and they picked two particular scenarios. One was we called it the seasonal scenario, and the other one was what generically we call a predictable, that approximately matched load of the electric system over the year. Technology development, we had two basic scenarios. One was what we called high and low. It's pretty simple. The high was where we expected to see fairly aggressive cost decreases as predicted. Actually, it wasn't aggressive, it was just what the predicted cost decreases for solar energy and wind energy and storage were going to be over the next 30 years. And then we had a low scenario where we said, well, what happens if it doesn't really get deployed that way? What if the costs don't come down quite as much, we don't have quite as much available, what does that mean in terms of the costs? And then the final kind of set of scenarios was the two that Stacy described already, which is our utility-led scenario and our all sectors-led. The utility scenario assumed that, and this is focused on the solar component, utility-led assumed that about 90% of all of the solar generation that we're talking about when we had these figures, 10% and 70% for solar and wind, was going to come from utility scale or community solar gardens. The all sector-led scaled that back. So it was only about 60%, and the remaining 40% was going to come from residential and commercial industrial distributed generation. And we looked at the different costs associated with that on a levelized cost basis, and that became part of the inputs of the model, and the outputs all of these scenarios according to how we mix and match across these different things, these different scenario profiles. So there's the numbers that I just said. Did I get it right? Yes, I did. 90% for 70% on utility and 20% solar for utility led, and then scaled it back. I guess 55% for those two under the all sectors scenario. The key questions we wanted to address in this analysis was what is the range of generation costs that we might expect, that we might have to produce that 10% by 2030 of solar, and then 70% of solar and wind combined by 2050. How much energy storage do we really need to do in order to achieve those goals? Can we build enough capacity economically in order to address the production variability of solar and wind energy resources? So as you ramp up the amount of capacity, in order to account for some of that variability, the more you build, the more you can produce on the edges of the production curve, but that does increase the cost. And then finally, can load shifting really improve utilization and reduce solar generation costs? So by load shifting, can you actually reduce the cost of solar generation? So this is the picture of where solar is at actually today. Actually, we're past this now, 1.5%, aren't we? But you can see the top graph there is basically this is a graph showing 14 days in the summertime. So it's about like a July streak of 14 days, and you can see what the production curve looks like on each one of those days. And the top graph is one that does not incorporate any solar into it. The graph down below is what it looks like when you incorporate 1.5% of total generation in the state is incorporated into this. How do you into that production profile? And you can see that it pretty much just kind of shaves off the peak on every one of those days when the sun is shining, because that's when the load is highest. And so it's actually a fairly easy thing to do. But when we get to 10%, what does that look like? So here you go. The graph on the bottom there is saying that's what solar production in the month of July, 14 days looks like. And this is actual model data of actual solar irradiance and production that we would model from that. And you can see that the solar production not only accounts for, in the middle of the day, all of the demand, but it cuts into the base load production and kind of oversteps that, and even goes down where we're essentially not capturing it at all. It's just being curtailed. Because all of that down in black is basically solar production that exceeds on that day the actual demand of the system. So we're producing more solar than we can possibly use.
And that's at 10% annual generation from solar.
Yeah, so if we did a 10% annually capacity increment, that's what it would look like if all we did was just add that to the system. So this is the difference. This is what Stacy noted earlier. This is the difference between solar in its infancy and solar when it's grown up. This is what you have to deal with when you're dealing with solar at scale, when it's a meaningful part of our state's energy portfolio.
Is that 10% supposing at 2030 in terms of demand?
Yeah.
So my favorite issue is that you generate the most energy with your solar modules if you aim them roughly south. But if you aim them east and west, you generate electricity when you need it in the morning and when you need it in the afternoon. So even though you don't generate as much, you generate the most valuable energy.
Yes.
So if that chart was changed so that the 10% was generated in the morning and the afternoon instead of midday, how would that chart?
Yeah, we did not model changing the orientation of the panels, but that's an option, and it does come into play conceptually anyway in the findings I'll show you in just a second.
Policy could lead that.
Right.
That'd be
fine. Well, and this is there's two ways to get to that, and I think that what we're going to model, what we're showing is basically a southern orientation, but it could have basically the same effect could be achieved by doing what you did, you just described.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is what when we look at what solar production looks like, did we check on this? Is this the 10% or is this the 70% scenario? I can't remember. But anyway, this is, you can see that the jagged blue line is the solar production on an annual basis. This is showing, this is every day of the year. We're showing just the daily production here, and that. The line kind of in the middle that's somewhat covered here, this is the actual demand. So you can see that when solar, on a day-by-day basis, when we're looking at scale, when we're looking at solar grown up, you can see that there are parts in the year, in the summertime, the spring and summertime, when solar is vastly exceeding what the demand is. And then there are points in the wintertime, later in the year, on both ends of the calendar there, where solar is underproducing. And so when you have a goal and you say you want 10% or you want 70% solar and wind, kind of those kinds of goals, you're ramping up capacity to the point where if you want to use that energy and meet your goal, you basically have to shift this down to here. That's a seasonal storage question, and that's very, very difficult to deal with. Our current storage technologies don't address that at all. So it's very expensive, it's very difficult to do, and this is the kind of scenario, unfortunately, that we typically are used to modeling when we talk about solar at scale within the utility system, is that people think about it this way. But what we said, the question we asked was, let's change that. Let's build enough solar and wind, and then, well, we're just going to show solar in this case, so that the solar production is almost always meeting demand. So in this case, you can see a great amount, it's a lot more solar than we just put on the system. And it's the same demand curve that we saw in that last graph. But you can see that in this graph, the solar production is exceeding demand in almost the entire year. Only a very narrow stretch down here, and then a couple little bits out there. But this is really defining what the point at which you're saying the solar is not meeting demand. Now, the flip side of what this means is that all this solar production that's up here is being curtailed. It's not being used. Because this is what demand is. Some of it's being stored, some of it's just being not used, but the point is that we've increased the amount of capacity in order to achieve this result. And is that cost effective or not? And so really what we found was building large amounts of solar and wind capacity and only dispatching it when it's needed, rather than trying to find a way to always use the energy that is produced by the solar system, provided a dramatic improvement in the economics of the total portfolio. So a full dispatch, in other words, using all the energy from your solar and wind capacity, requires significant shifting across seasons. A generation from periods of high production to periods of low production across the year. But if you just increase the amount of capacity and don't worry about how much of that energy you're actually using, but think about it as a capacity addition, it dramatically reduces those energy shifting needs. And in fact, what we ended up modeling was, if you take that solar and that wind energy portfolio along with storage, there's a bunch of storage in here, that you could dispatch when those resources are producing, when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing, but you only actually use the energy 50% of the time, you basically would shift the amount of storage you would need dramatically down by 5 times. Increasing the amount of solar and wind by 2 times decreases the amount of storage you need by 5 times, and storage is the most expensive component of this portfolio. So that is what ultimately, kind of rethinking the way we use solar, kind of solar grown up, is part of this, and it dramatically reduces the amount of investment we need to make in things like storage, which brings the total portfolio cost way down. So this is actually a graph that shows the storage state of charge. So if we have this big storage resource that we're going to be building, and I can't remember if we have the actual number in here, but we're actually, in this portfolio, we're using a lot of storage, okay? But if we look at what the storage state of charge is, there's this, and I pointed this out earlier, this point here in late December where it plunges way down because both the solar and the wind energy resource are at low production at that point in the year. according to historic resource measurements. And that drives your storage need. You know, how much storage do you need? You know, most of the year you need not that much. Here you need a whole bunch. There's a big cost that you have to make an investment in that's really used for just this week. And so we kind of look, and
The new results.
you did?
Uh-huh.
Okay, is this the new results?
Yes.
Okay. So what we looked at was how do we, what are the other options to address that 1 week, other than overbuilding our storage and our wind resources in order to meet that amount, and looked at other kinds of generation resources, such as maybe some natural gas or just greater reliance on other resources in the MISO region, which is our non-Minnesota kind of interconnection that we're part of, in order to see what the difference was about how much curtailment you needed to do relative. I'm sorry, that's the curtailment. Curtailment relative to the amount of generation that was not going to be wind or solar. And we discovered that there's, you can see that there's some sweet spots in here about where you would do that in terms of maximizing your solar and wind, but minimizing the amount of storage that you would need. And I'm sorry, what is the difference here, Stacy, between these two graphs?
This is 2050.
Oh, okay, this is 2025, and that's 2050. Is that
The
right?
last was 2052. This is brand new, hot off the press.
Yeah.
From our modeling team.
Yeah, Stacy told me she was gonna put this in, and then I obviously didn't look at it.
We'll figure it out with you. Let's see the first, is it the first one?
So generation cost.
Effective utilizing other generation resources through periods. It's the same.
Generation cost. Yeah. It was the same.
Oh,
But
it's the high technology versus the low technology.
Oh, okay.
That's what it is.
Very
Okay,
good.
thank you. So one of these, this one is based upon the aggressive kind of cost reductions that we expect to see actually in solar and wind. And then on this one, we looked at what happens if we actually don't get those cost reductions, and we see a different kind of sweet spot. So you actually have to end up with more non-solar and wind deployment in order to get your costs down to the point where it's cost effective. That was the reason those two words.
What does curtailment mean?
Curtailment is shutting it down. So basically, when you have a wind turbine that's turning in the wind, but there's not enough electric demand to take the energy from it, they just turn it off. And we already do that with our wind energy system, is that we curtail it a fair amount in some points in the year when demand on the system is low, but that wind is still blowing. So and so it's kind of and some people think of it as wasted energy, but what we're trying to say is it's just like a power plant. If you don't need it, you turn it off.
Because, hang on, this question doesn't really maybe into this slide or anything, but when you're trying to adjust load, how does it affect the consumer? Is that all at the utility scale, is figuring that out?
Correct.
Whether your load is in the storage and adjusting and doing all the modifications?
Right, yeah, and it's a process that the utilities and the utilities and then the transmission system operators already do. Every 15 minutes, they're making adjustments about trying to adjust how much capacity in the system versus how much is being demanded by consumers. So consumers, when you really see how the system works and you kind of see it all modeled out, it's kind of a miracle. I mean, it's really pretty amazing. Every 15 minutes, they're making changes in response to whether or not you turned your air conditioning on. You and everybody else in the world. But
so I've seen the photographs of like I think one of the MISO headquarters or
Right.
something like that, where it's just all computer screens. It looks like air traffic control.
Right.
With everybody at their stations just adjusting, trying
Right.
to get these things, and then you put throw a new wall onto the picture, you know, or, you know, your local swimming pool needs heating, you know, I mean, you know, all these things just are constant changes to the big dynamic.
Right, and those things are going on already now, and in our modeling, we also
Yeah.
assume that they would continue to go on, although we actually expected that we see a lot more electric use because of EV charging and heating the buildings. You have a question, Jim?
Well, in answering her question, some utilities have programs with their consumers. They can just turn off their air conditioners, their electric water heaters.
Yes, and that's the perfect segue into what Stacy's going to talk about right now. Because we address that in our modeling.
Yeah, but you already do. To answer her question, it does reflect back to the consumer.
That's what I was wondering about, if any of this assumes some of the changes in lifestyle or when my hot water is heated
I see.
or stuff like that.
Yes, although we basically, the goal was to make it as transparent to the consumer as possible. We assumed that that's what it would be, but Stacy's going to talk about that now.
So we did want to look at, particularly given the emphasis on electrification and transportation and heating, what we could do in terms of load shifting. So having loads that are responsive to what the rest of the system is doing. And in particular, we were looking at residential loads, including electric vehicles, domestic hot water, and we looked at HVAC. And what we wanted to see was whether being able to control these loads would reduce the cost of meeting our preferred solar production profile and those scenarios that Brian shared with you. What we found was that the economic benefits of load shifting, while they exist, they were particularly strong for electric vehicles because with those loads, it's possible to actually shift over a period of days. When you're talking about hot water, people want hot water daily. And so what we're typically able to do is, under existing programs today, we shift that load to evening hours. So we're talking about hours. For HVAC, what we found was you can perhaps shift for a few hours, but there's not a lot of wiggle room there. If your house is calling for heat, you're going to want it. And so we focused the project on electric vehicle and domestic hot water, residential domestic hot water. And I think we assumed that maybe 60% of electric vehicles would sign up for a voluntary program to participate in a load shifting program so that they could save money. Yes.
So will you revisit heating? Because, the northern two-thirds of the state, anybody who builds a new house pours a concrete slab and puts in for heating. And it takes them 3 days to heat those slabs up. And then it takes them, and then the weather gets warm, and they say, oh my God, I had to open all my windows because I can't cool my slab off.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the Stethus ceramic brick heat storage units that are made in Dickinson, North Dakota. I have one of those. But
Sure.
they're baseboard replacements, and you can heat them up. You heat the ceramics when the electricity's cheap, and then the heat's there all the time.
That's a good point. And under that scenario where you have in-floor radiant heat available, you could squeeze some more hours out of that. You could shift that load more than if it were forced air.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. But for this exercise, we did just focus on electric vehicles and domestic hot water. Because we're looking at the 2025 timeframe. It becomes probably more interesting in 2050 or we have new housing starts and rebuilding, replacing.
Since you're going to comment, when you say domestic hot water, are you also modeling any transition in the from natural gas to electricity?
Yes, we are, we did, I'm trying to remember the specifics. The question was about whether we assumed that there would be some portion of heating that would, both domestic hot water and HVAC, that would go electric. And we did model that there was an aggressive uptake in electric heating replacing natural gas. So here are some assumptions. The solar potential analysis assumed electrification of vehicles, domestic hot water. We focused on those. And due to the time period over which we wanted to shift loads, we just really found that it was best to focus on EVs. When we looked at the peak resulting from EVs, I think it was 10 gigawatts potentially by the year 2050 if we have an aggressive uptake in electric vehicle adoption. And just to give you some sense of scale, right now Minnesota's peak is 16 gigawatts, and it's been right about there for quite some time. So adding 10 gigawatts more of load is quite something. If everyone comes home and plugs in at the same time, that would definitely impact our utility grid. So what we wanted to emphasize as one of the learnings from this project was how important it's going to be to incorporate smart charging or to have some sort of mechanism whereby we're influencing electric vehicle drivers' behavior so that they're not coming home and plugging in all at the same time, coincident with our natural utility system peak. We want to defer that to either times that are overnight, although what we did find was that at some point with all this electrification, Minnesota will see a winter peak and not just a summer peak. So that makes it more interesting. The other option, which Brian and I are working on a project right now, looking at smart charging, where we're assuming at some higher penetrations of solar, we may have excess solar, and that might be a great time to charge your car. And so incentivizing people through programs to be willing to charge in the middle of the day or whenever there's excess solar or wind. There is a cost reduction potential from the ability to shift your load, and it can actually reduce costs by up to 20%. That was the rosy outlook. So it's somewhat significant, and particularly with EVs, most of that 20% savings was the ability to control when you charge your car. There are potential distribution challenges. Again, becomes very important in mitigating those, that the utility be able to establish programs that help you know when to charge. Oops. I think I'll skip up. Doug, are we out of time? He says yes. Okay. Brian, do you want to cover just the price or the cost?
Sure.
Stacy, we can hardly take another 10 minutes, so that helps.
10 minutes? Okay.
Does this assume that that if somebody has an EV, they're just plugging into the utility, not that they're plugging into a storage unit, that they've got a solar charge?
Yes, this assumes that electric vehicle drivers are plugging in to the grid at some point, either workplace or at home.
So this is the cost findings really, is that we found that between the kind of the extremes that we looked at between the high and low technology scenarios, We saw for the 2025 timeframe about $40 a megawatt hour for 10% solar and $70 a megawatt hour for 10% solar under the low-tech scenario. The $40 per megawatt hour is basically cost competitive with generation costs now. So what we found was that at 10% under the expected scenarios of technology that we would be able to achieve solar costs that were cost competitive at 10% with the in 2025. And that did include, however, a great deal of storage, about 5 gigawatt hours of storage, which is a lot. A pretty aggressive rollout of storage between now and 2025. And then...
That might be more than what the U.S. has installed today.
Yeah, that's cool. It's interesting.
Yeah. And then it does require that a curtailment or a dispatch rate of 20 to 30% and a build out of capacity and then not using some of that capacity or using it only when needed of about 20 to 30%. The 2050 timeframe, when we looked at the solar plus wind scenarios, we're looking at $50 a megawatt hour for the high tech and $100 for the low tech, and that does not include the new. That's not the new numbers, right? That's the because when we actually modeled this and kind of said the new slides that we showed that I couldn't remember what they were first. When we put those numbers in, I believe that $50 dropped down to less than 40. It was in the 30s. So it's a substantial decrease by just addressing that 1 week worth of low production. But when you look at the expected storage needs for that 2050 scenario, we're talking about a lot of storage. We're talking about 200 gigawatt hours of storage. And that's kind of what's forecast by 2050 in terms of what people think the technology is going to happen. But this is a lot of energy storage. And the kind of dispatch rate of the capacity that we have is actually at 50% or even higher in some cases. So you're building out a resource for its capacity, and then you're only going to be using it maybe 50% or 30 or 40% of the time. But that's actually the cost-effective way to get it done.
There's an important caveat there in small print at the bottom, in which we talk about how this is a Minnesota-specific study, and we looked at the geographic footprint of Minnesota. We didn't consider Wisconsin, North Dakota, anyone else's generation. So to the extent that in 2025 and 2050, we're still part of MISO, which I think you had a tour of recently, these costs can only go down. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a fairly conservative number. So this is just a restating of conclusions here, and do we want to stop here?
You can stop and take questions.
And then the next thing that we're going to do in this program is this solar deployment strategy model, a new model that we're developing, which we're going to try to get to greater granularity about how this all works. And also, so rather than looking at statewide, we may look at just the city of St. Paul, or just Otter Tail Power, or just Rochester, and kind of see what it means at that scale, plus what are some of the different strategies that have different impacts on solar deployment. What happens when you change rate design? What happens when you make different assumptions about how people will value the resilience benefit of solar? And we have just a couple of things. I'll flip through this. This is all the solar deployment strategy. The kinds of things that that model will calculate include societal, customer, and utility value propositions, PV adoption rates, other kinds of metrics, things by PV adoption by customer class or within a particular city or county that can be modeled. This is the goal we want to get to. And it allows the user, which would be the Department of Commerce probably, it's not going to be something that will be publicly available, but it's something that can be used by an entity that has the capability to do it. But they'll be able to say, for instance, you can see these kind of sliders on the right there. How important is it that we address the transmission value that is impacted by different kinds of deployment strategies? We can make it set at low, we can set it at high, and the model will incorporate that, and depending on what your assumptions are about transmission. And resiliency is another thing. how will a consumer value resilience of solar energy on their home? If they value it very low, it will have a very small impact on deployment. If they value it high, people will be much more likely, because it's not just energy savings, but also resilience, kind of the ability to be energy independent. It will increase deployment. And so we want to capture those kinds of things that aren't always captured in utility modeling. Some similarity to the value of solar, and we're going to be doing, and then we have the survey, but we don't have time for that. That's what it sounds like. Okay.
What should this group, or if we go out, the state fair, I mean, what is the big message you would get to the general public, you know, the positive message? Are utilities excited about this?
Yeah, none of this was really a surprise to the utilities. I do think that, you know, they're a little bit worried about how people will perceive it. But really what we did here was we demonstrated that you can meet Minnesota's energy needs 70% with solar energy, wind, not just on an annual basis, but every single hour of the year. So that makes it basically a perfectly predictable, dispatchable resource. And the interesting thing is that when you get to that, when you look at it that way, there's really nothing to say we couldn't do 100%, because the costs are the same. And there are some cost per megawatt hour are the same. So we picked 70 because it matched with some of the MISO studies that were being done. They were looking at 70, we looked at 70. Could you do 100? You could do 100. Now there's some transmission and distribution impacts that we did not consider. The transmission ones, we did look at the cost of that and an estimation, and a preliminary estimation, I have to be careful how I say this for a minute, of what the transmission impacts would be, and we discovered that it will probably increase them to go with a 70% or even 100%, but not significantly. It's not enough to really make a difference according to other variables. The distribution system impacts are a little bit more complicated because that's where you start talking about if everybody in Minneapolis plugs in their EV at the same time, it doesn't matter how much solar you have up in Benton County. You know, it's going to have an impact on the distribution system that would require a massive build out, and so that has to be addressed locally rather than at the generation scale.
Yes. A very general question, might be a very silly question. So it seems like the biggest problem is the peaks and valleys, right? Whether it's seasonal, between summer and winter, or day and night, right? So how realistic is it to tap into? Because when we have a lot of sun here in the summer, South America, they have their winter, right? And when during the day when we have a lot of sun here, Europe, they have night. So how realistic is it to tap into whether it's the Europe grid or the South American grid? We don't have to do the storing issue, and we don't have to deal with the extra capacity.
I don't think we looked at that. Stacy, do you know anybody who is looking at that, kind of extending the grid? Right now, we have MISO, which is how many states? 17 states, and 2 provinces of Canada, and then we have MISO is connected to other ones, PJM, and to New England, and down to ERCOT down in Texas, and that's called the Eastern Interconnect. And so there's a separate study that's looking at the Eastern Interconnect. But we haven't even, in the modeling we've been doing, even looked at just the United States as a whole. So we haven't even gotten close to looking at South America or Europe. I guess that's my correct answer.
And one more question.
I know we're above average in Minnesota, of course. Have you looked at what Europe's doing? Because they're way ahead of us, I think, as far as solar utilization and renewable energy. And what comparison are you making, looking at, say, Germany or some of those other countries? And they're actually part of the market. They're still doing pretty well.
Well, actually, on the wind energy side, we're ahead of them, especially in Minnesota and the Midwest. We deploy a very large amount of wind, and the forecasts are going to be great. So we're actually, they look to us really when they talk about the wind energy piece. The solar energy piece, obviously, Germany got a big head start with, how they deployed it. there are lessons to be learned from that, and really, the questions that they're now dealing with, this study is basically addressing those very questions. Because it's saying, how do they deal with the dramatic overproduction of solar in the middle of the day in their system? And one of the dilemmas that they have, that we have put on the table as something that we want to address, is the way we pay for solar energy now at the utility scale, right, is we write purchase power agreements with developers for basically all the energy they produce. Well, but if in our model, we're saying we're only going to use it 50% of the time. Well, that means we're only going to be paying 50% of the money. And that doesn't work for the finance fee. So, we know this will work, kind of to address the kind of questions that have already come up in Germany and in the European markets about the overproduction of solar. They haven't yet figured out how to do that dispatch, kind of that dispatch model we're talking about in a way that is actually gets down to the project level. It's one thing to talk about it at the state level. It's another thing to say, now, how do you find a developer and get a financier and you write a contract that will actually pay for itself in a way that allows the utility to say, no, we don't want any more of your energy right now, but we still have to pay for the system. And that's a whole different model of how we do those kinds of development.
And so this was exclusively a technical analysis. We didn't get into rate design questions and things like that. One thing we're ahead of Germany on, though, is that we're already starting to think at 1% solar penetration in Minnesota. We're starting to think about smart inverters and how those can be included to solve problems, the problems that Germany is experiencing. So that's one lesson I think that the U.S. and Minnesota is taking away from Germany and Europe.
Well, let's get, you got one more?
Just one tiny one. It seemed like you're completely addressing residential use in your study. I was wondering if you could just quickly say, in our state, residential equals X amount of all the consumption.
Oh, we're at about between, 25 and 30% of our energy is residential load.
Yeah, but in a sense, we are not just addressing residential in this study. We're addressing all energy in this study.
Okay.
All the
That's that baseline is where the rest of that falls in.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're looking at the entire state's demand.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's give them a big hand.